I just will give you the plan of my talk, and I apologize for my not so good English, not so fluent. So forgive me if I read a paper. I try to do it in the most readable manner. So what is this title a little obscure? I begin by the following observation. The analysis and the reflections on the ecological crisis, the climatic mutation, or the finiteness of the resources of the planet hardly arrive to become the basic elements of political visions of the future. They never succeeded, at least in our countries, to structure the national political debates at the time, for instance, of the elections in our countries. These analyses have always difficulties in making other features of the contemporary situation coexist. Question of work and employment, or social protection, social inequalities, migration issues, questions of security or identity, and so on, which very often supplant the environmental concerns of the people in the world and prevent the political debate on them. And here I listed questions which are important in Western countries. Obviously, for other countries in the South, the problems would be extreme poverty, drinkable water, questions of pollution, and poverty, and so on. So in my opinion, this tension between isolation of the climate problem and dissolution of it among the various other challenges that societies face is one of the main sources of the difficulties of its governance at all scales, and this at least for 30 years. So, is it possible to put a cursor between these two extremes and where it could be? Let's take a look back at the period of 1990 until 2010 and even later. The idea of sustainable development, which was supposed to keep together environmental protection, economic growth, and social concerns, was in 1992 at its peak. This project of fundamentally social democrat and ecological inspiration is part of a Keynesian line extended to the environment in the possibility of setting goals for the common good, a line which postulates that markets could be regulated, that it is necessary to think about life in common and to deliberate on it, which thinks it is useful to apprehend it first by collective thought, exchange, and reason. A project that could not fail to meet different economic and political logics and contradictory, logic of market and consumption, logics of entrepreneur and financier, who aspire to rapid returns on investment, etc. So two universes collided, whose temporalities are profoundly different, since one privileges the long term and the general interest, and the other, the immediate utility, the constraints, and the interest here and now. So the two antagonistic projects clashed violently, and we know that the neoliberal conservative project won. However, the mythical idea and story of sustainable development continued, progressively emptied of any substance. It became a syntagm with the contradictory meanings and demands. And since that time, multilateral arenas have always governed without really projecting ourselves into a desirable future. And recently, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted recently, they cannot draw any desirable future, at least in our countries, in the West developed countries. On the climate side, between Kyoto and Copenhagen and even until Paris COP21, the governance has increasingly isolated the climate problem for other global issues, emphasizing the only environmental reading that has abandoned any idea of direct regulation by standards or rules or by an explicit industrial policy. Second, restricting the economic question to the only grammar of the carbon price in favor of an invisible coordination of actors by the prices and the markets of negotiable permits. And finally, deliberately ignoring the geopolitical aspects of the problem. So several social scientists, Mike Yule, the authors of the Hartwell paper, which are also converging with this question of the weak problem, in the United States, the Breakthrough Institute, and so on, severally criticized climate reductionism. They called climate reductionism of the climate governance, even that of IPCC. I don't share all these critiques, but I mention them. But a schism of reality has been at work for nearly 20 years in the face of climate risk. To it, a grown gap between an external reality, that of the globalization of markets, the exploitation unbridled of fossil fuels resources, and states caught up in a fierce economic competition ever more attached to their national sovereignty. And on the other side, the sphere of negotiation and governance that is charged of an imaginary, of a great central regulator capable of defining and distributing emission rights, which was increasingly disconnected from this world external. Another aspect of this schism of reality is, for instance, the meteoric rise of the Chinese economy, whose growth has shaken many certainties within the climate regime and disrupted long-standing hierarchies of nation-states. And inside the climate arenas, it was absolutely politically incorrect to discuss or to discuss of these questions. So, despite criticism of the historical responsibility of Western countries, developing countries are engaged in the same pattern of growth than us and aspire to the same model, a predatory model, obviously, a situation all the more worrying for all together. Here also, the emergence of a desirable counter-model does not yet exist. What happened with the, sorry, I don't know why I am here. Let us come to the rupture of the Anthropocene. I don't want to enter in all the detail, but with the ecological crisis deepening, the diagnosis of the Anthropocene resonated as a realization of a rupture, an irreversible rupture. It constitutes at the same time a diagnosis, a scientific diagnosis, but also a general thesis, a cosmology, and a historical and prospective account. The Anthropocene seems destined to become the matrix of several distinct emergent futures. First, the different apocalyptic narrative of the future. Second, the future of degrowth or decrease. And finally, the hubris of the technological future of planetary geoengineering. Three stories that have diffused in the intellectual world, but have so far found very little place in natural debates, in national debates, or in the international arenas. The Anthropocene is the era of catastrophes, in the sense of a future very unstable, nonlinear, whose measured disturbances will be the norm. It's also the era of collapse, which can be as slow end of growth as brutal, like a risk of systemic collapse. But these visions of the future have not still found their place in the political stages or arenas. And I think it is clearly due to the catastrophic character, the followers of collapsology or the adepts or the apostles of the decline, to the scale of and the radicality of their positions carried by intellectuals or economists, but dissident and outside the established political field. Finally, since the Paris Agreement, 4 years ago now, one can say that climate problem has become, on one hand, a planetarian question, capable of crystallizing a series of issues, but on the other, the so-called climatization of the world has its limit and operates by intermittent poofs and disappear from COP to COP. So nevertheless, the recent European elections have seen in many countries an unprecedented success in the vote for the Green parties. And also there is an undeniable rise in the awareness of the environmental crisis and the climate risks. So there is, in my point of view, a window of opportunity, at least in Europe, but the climate geopolitics has never been so cleaved with several climate deniers in power. And we can mention Trump, but also Bolsonaro, and in Europe, far extreme right groups and parties, which are more or less at the power in some states in Eastern Europe or in Italy, and so on. Before coming to the project of the so-called ecological modernization, which is more or less implicitly the only reformist vision which emerged in climate arenas, I would like, if you allow me, to talk a little about what we experienced in France this winter. A period that seems very paradoxical, with a very violent popular revolt that started against the carbon tax, and at the same time, an incredible mobilization, cheering, in my point of view, of the youth of the world, and in particular the youth of France, to preserve the climate and the environment. It is the famous demonstration each Friday. In the expression of the ones as the others, the same slogan returns. End of the month, end of the world, same fight. For some, this means that social and environmental problems have a common origin. It is obviously much too simple and false. But in fact, what does it matter, really? In any case, this expresses the very strong feeling that we cannot advance on the environmental cause and climate cause without, at the same time, taking care of the social. The ecological transition will be solidary or will not be. Of course, there may be contradictions, or conflicts between the different objectives, but there are also possible synergies, strong synergies. I give just one example, but you know much more than me. Thermal insulation of dwellings, a major issue for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in France, for instance, which also reduces the energy bill for households, especially the poorest, and should create many jobs that cannot be decayed. Some of our European neighbors have been able to industrialize the thermal renovation of buildings at a much higher rate than in France. So it's starting to be an important political debate on this point this winter. Another example, it would be necessary to generalize the zero-rate loan for all objects of the transition: insulations, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and so on. In his letter to the French, the President Macron asked some questions, among many others, about what sacrifices people could accept in their habits and lifestyles. But, in my point of view, the ecological transition is not a simple addition of points, of a few points among many others. On the contrary, it requires to offer a coherent and global project. The desirable evolution of habits and lifestyles is necessarily constrained by the general framework of the infrastructures proposed by the country, and determined also by the cultural values put forward by society and powers. So, constructing an economy or a society low carbon, as we said, is a profound transformation, both material and social, comparable to the great transformation described by Karl Polanyi for the Industrial Revolution. It cannot be apprehended in the individualist framework. What Polanyi shows is that after the metabolic shock of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, the states and the societies have been able to engender the democratic process to adapt to it, and this took several decades in the 19th century. But they also failed, for instance, to find the meaning of the search, a big search, for territorial protections. And the question of the earth, in the sense of belonging to a soil, become toxic par excellence. It was the conservative and fascist movements in the beginning of the 20th century that perceived this concern, and we know what happened after. From this point of view, it is very striking that the revolt of the Yellow Vests in France, which put forward the questions of the territories, presents such analogies. So I come to the European level. In fact, one can consider the ecological modernization is likely an oxymoron. Its perspective for developed society is, if not to go back in an impossible transformation backwards, but to change the trajectory that these societies have borrowed since the industrial era, and to do it gradually. So this is why the prospect remains risky. Has it really started? Where it is already claiming to work, and could hardly carry total conviction. However, this vision was heard in the climatic arenas, in think tanks, carried by different actors and very in personalities. lead authors of the IPCC, ministers of environment, think tanks, and so on and so on. The most complete and symptomatic example of this vision, in my point of view, has been the report, the German report, World in Transition, a global contract for sustainability, that the think tank WGU diffused in Durban and after. But the first time I saw it and I saw the impact it had at Durban at the COP number 11, I think. If this report was not so original in terms of analysis of the existing, it is more by its will to take into account all the dimensions, in particular also social and cultural, towards a new social contract. It is in the title. Among the technological aspects of the transformations, three main pillars are described in particular: that of the energetic transition and transportation system, that of the urban development, and that of the land use. To be more credible, in my point of view, the prospect of this transformation should fulfill at least three additional conditions. Do not pretend to any universal character. Indeed, it is first of all a way of solutions, plural and diversified for developed Western countries, and the South need the transformations and the policies are largely to invent for these countries, and we cannot do that for them. Second, include in the project the issue of adaptation, which is absolutely now crucial, given the inertia of the climate and the point where we are. And also the adaptation poses a lot of problems, technical, but also social, political, and ethical. And above all, the third condition for me is to include the judgment of certain sectors and economic activities or certain technologies, particularly aggravating the problem of the ecological degradation. We know that the history of energy, for instance, is more or less a story of energy addition rather than substitutions, and also small disinhibitions which added. So we have to really pose the crucial questions of how to stop certain technologies, certain ways of producing, certain ways to consume, and to influence others urgently. Engaging this transformation today is first and foremost a matter of investing in energy efficiency, renewable energies, industrial processes, organic farming, and healthy food eating. For these investments, tools exist, such as the European Investment Bank or the Climate Bank, whose French presidency took over the idea. Because yes, it needs money, a lot of money, to decarbonize the economy. Where to find it? In fact, money exists. We know that it exists, and it is not lacking at all. The CICE, the dividend of CAC 40 companies, long-term savings in search of safe investments, and the billions of that the European Central Bank has injected after the crisis of 2008. But we need to be able to steer it more towards ecological transformation. Some decision could be taken at the level of a national country as France, but I think that others need to be taken at the European level, which is crucial. It will be necessary to pull out, for instance, the investments of this ecological transition from the Maastricht criteria and manage to direct them, the money of the European Central Bank towards the energy transition. So this Green New Deal, which is behind this, project, is an in-depth rethinking of what is a debt. What is a debt, to give a certain space for maneuver in investment. And in short, it is rethinking the categories of the public accounting, as already the Stiglitz Commission suggested 10 years ago to meet the major challenge of climate change. In the end, it is also a question of relaunching the European project for and by the ecological transition, the only theme, in my view, likely to be able to reach consensus in Europe, to remove the reluctance of some of our neighbors, powerful neighbors, towards a greater European solidarity. And also, above all, it is the theme that we observed this last year, that can create in youth a new enthusiasm for the European project and hinder the return of nationalism and the rise of populism. So I just now say here, I want to remind this phrase of Ulrich Beck, who explained that the notion of our environment is either too narrow when it excludes the human and social action, or too wide and life-threatening when it includes it, because at that point it doesn't reflect politics as the deepest required changes. And all I have that in mind. So I want to achieve my lecture by, we know that further setbacks occurred recently. US President Donald Trump and certain elites in the American society have brought in the geopolitical scene an ignorant nationalist agenda to power, denied climate change, destroyed environmental regulation, and denounced the ideal of a common world that the post-World War II liberal dream and multilateralism have shared. I just want to, yes, I think that what President Trump declared, that we don't live on the same earth, we don't have the same values or the same interests. America first. That is the profound significance of this. So today, I think that the question of climatic mutation and its denial, the question of the neoliberal deregulations, which led to the vertiginous explosion of inequalities that raises so many problems, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, I think. And third, the question of territories correlative to the question of migrations, because they are linked. These questions are closely linked. These three questions seem to go well together. It is a convergent threat that we only respond together, to it together. Bruno Latour says this. Bruno Latour is a philosopher and sociologist, a French philosopher that I am sure you know. And his thesis is that these three previous questions, yes, were created in the 90s because some of the American economic elite have perceived the climate threat in the sense of the planetary boundaries, and they decided to respond by denial, the abandon of solidarity, and the flight to the enrichment of the 1% of the 1%. And this happened exactly at the beginning of the 90s and developed in these years. This is the thesis of Latour. I am not absolutely convinced of the lucidity of this elite at this point of the 90s, but I think that how do you say, thanks to Trump, people brutally realized that what they ignored for too long, that the climate issue is at the heart not only of environmental issues, but also of geopolitical issues. The rivalry, the main rivalry with China, but not only, with a lot of Russia and a lot of questions belonging to geopolitics, and directly related to the issue of injustice, inequality, and migration. The response of these three major problems that we face, rise of immigration and populism, rise of inequalities, and climate change are linked, and it is the same threat as I mentioned. And the link is what? Is the denial of climate change, and its imprint, and its profound meaning. So the arrow of the time of the moderns had led us to the ideal of progress and globalization. On another side, too long, ecologists defended the return to local, but unlocal conceived as folding and regression. And all that did not make a very enthusiastic program. So what Bruno Latour is the first, according to me, to engage seriously the way of holding together several of these problems and connecting them. And also he offers us a way to change the setting and horizon. How do we envision the future and the past? What is progressive and what is regressive or retrograde? How blurred the opposition, which we observed, between right and left and global and local. And finally, why we must operate not a change at 180 degrees, but at 90 degrees, and a turn that redefine all these categories and to find what he calls the terrestrial, because his book is landing, how landing in French, ou atterrir. I think I am not sure that it has been already translated, but he will be. I don't know exactly. So thank you very much.